So in this lecture video, I will be finishing the competency developing sustainable literacy, and in this lecture video, I will be particularly focusing on these three learning objectives: the energy sources, key pieces of legislation related to sustainability, and a very brief overview of systems thinking. Systems thinking is a highly complex subject, so I will not talk too much in detail about that. So the fuel sources that we use based on 2017 data is, if you look at this distribution, is most of the energy sources are from the non-renewable sector. So if you look at petroleum, natural gas, and coal, those are non-renewable resources. And if you throw in uranium in there, that is also a non-renewable resource. Note that under renewable resource, solar and wind is actually listed there, even though we know that from a previous lecture video, these are actually called perpetual resources. For purposes of energy consumption, normally they're divided into renewable, which involves both renewable and perpetual resources, and non-renewable resources. So as we can see, the majority of our energy sources is from, in this case, fossil fuels. These main three things. Now, we always know for a fact, and I hope at this point that everyone understands that there are some negative consequences in burning high amounts of fossil fuels. And in the previous lecture video, I already talked a little bit about global, in this case, climate change, the greenhouse effect of carbon dioxide, which is emitted primarily from these sources. On top of that, we also need to understand that there are other dangers, not primarily just based on carbon dioxide, based on this fossil fuel resources. Just think about it. If you've ever been behind a person, or in this case, a vehicle that has a broken tailpipe, or in this case, has a very terrible exhaust fumes coming out, we know that there are some health issues that actually comes from, in this case, fossil fuels. The other problems with these fossil fuels is coal, specifically coal. Coal is from the ground. Okay, so I hope everyone knows that coal actually is mined from the ground. And the ground also contains heavy metals like mercury and copper and all of these other contaminants. So coal that we harvest from coal mines are not just pure coal, they actually have contaminants as well. And the reason why they have contaminants like mercury is a metal which actually occurs in soil. So when you burn coal, guess what comes off it? Mercury. So then you have mercury and lead poisoning. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why we actually have some contaminant byproducts that actually comes from the burning of fossil fuels. Now, you might be thinking and sitting down right now and say, well, these are bad, these are all good. That is not really a shortcut way of thinking about that. The reason why we use a lot of this is they're much more easily accessible, right? They give you much more energy than some of this. Okay, and we will be talking more about this in detail in succeeding chapters. But these are easy to access. The technology that extracts these resources are already highly mature. So in this case, getting them is relatively easier than getting energy from these other components, from the renewable resources. So that's one problem. Okay, the other thing too is you have to understand about the industry as well. All of this drives the automobile industry. Obviously, we cannot just stop this, because then what are you going to use to drive your car from Sheboygan to Cleveland, or from Manitowoc to Cleveland, right? So that is actually very important. The other thing is uranium. Uranium, again, is in this case nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, this actually gives you a lot of bang, like really huge amounts of energy from very small quantities. The problem with this is the byproducts of nuclear energy is highly hazardous. Okay, so in fact, if you are exposed to uranium, or in this case even byproducts of uranium processing, you can actually get cancer in this case. Right? So there are clear trade-offs when you, in this case, when you exchange one source of energy with another. There's no such thing as, even these things that we have, like Wind or solar energy. Well, solar energy requires solar panels. The components of solar panels, some of them are actually quite toxic. Okay, so we cannot just say, oh, this is easy, we'll do solar power. Wind. Wind is good, right? Wind is free, wind is clear. But in this case, we already know that wind turbines actually is aesthetically not pleasing, right? They litter the environment, like our site, depending on how you look at it. This is again depending on how you view it. The other thing that actually occurs with wind is there's actually a lot of fowl, flying, and in this case birds, that actually can get hit by wind turbines. Okay, so that's also a very interesting thing. All right, hydropower. These are damming from dams. Well, there are actually negative effects of dams. In China, where they had the Three Gorges Dam, what happens is they actually flooded multiple communities in order to actually create this dam in this case. So there are always trade-offs. So there's never such a like a clear-cut black and white. There's always some gray when you start trying to change from one energy source to the other. Also, just remember that this lecture video is meant to be very brief. There are more information that's actually presented to you in the PowerPoint slides that actually accompany this lecture video. Okay, so now we're talking about the second learning objective, which is about environmental policy. So there are multiple approaches to environmental policy, and I just want to make sure that I talk about some of this very quickly. What we're doing right now is called the command and control approach, and that is the government hands down policies and regulations, and when you violate something, what happens is you get fines. Okay, you get, like in this case, you get there's prosecution of companies that actually, in this case, breaks up some of this policies that's in this case given up forth by the federal government, and in this case the main enforcement body for environmental policy in the United States is the Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, so this is heavy-handed. There are alternative approaches, and these are called capitalist approaches because they're based on economics. In this case, we have tax breaks. So what that means to say is, think about you right now. If you buy a green car, in fact, you might want to buy one soon because the tax break is going to end soon. If you buy a Prius, you're going to get, although the car is very expensive, you're going to get a rebate in the form of a tax break. All right, so that's one thing. Subsidies is, let's say, a farmer, like a farmer may like to grow a certain crop that might be energy intensive, that might require more fertilizers and more pesticides. Well, the government can say, well, if I pay you X thousands of dollars a year, can you please switch to a crop that requires you to use less fertilizer and less, in this case, less pesticides. Okay, so those are tax breaks and subsidies. There's also green taxes. So let's say I want to drive a, I don't know, let's say 800 horsepower, I don't know, like V12 Ford 6500. Okay, I'm just making this up. You probably know what that is. Well, what can happen is then the government can say, well, you have a vehicle that emits a lot, so we're gonna give you an extra tax when you actually buy this vehicle. So that's actually green tax. Okay, so green tax and tax breaks are opposite of each other if you want to think about it that way. Then we have this much more interesting technique which is called permit trading, and permit trading is one of the things that you probably heard about. Is called cap and trade system. So what that means to say is, let's say I'm a company. Let's say I'm Kohler Company. Okay, because we know who Kohler Company is. Okay, so let's say Kohler Company is allowed to emit 70 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year. Okay, now a rival or a friendly rival of Kohler Company is Bemis. Okay, so let's say Bemis has an allowance to use 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year. These are actually very, very small numbers. Okay, so at the end of the year, or even before the year ends, if Kohler Company says, oh, we're going to exceed the 70 gigatons that's allotted to us by the government, which means to say that we may have to pay green taxes, what they can do is if Bemis doesn't use all of the allotted carbon dioxide, all right, emission, what they can do is they can actually buy that from Bemis. So that's the cap and trade system. And FY, this is not just based on carbon dioxide, it could be based upon, in this case, hazardous substances that is accidentally discharged into the stream, like polycyclic biphenyls, okay, polyaromatic, okay, hydrocarbons. These are words that you probably have no idea about. These are poisonous substances that are normally, in this case, accidentally released into the atmosphere. You could actually cap and trade system for a lot of things, not just carbon dioxide. Okay, so there are many ways that a government can actually induce companies in their countries to actually follow sustainable practices. All right, very important. All right, so based on this command, and mostly command and control, we're going to talk about a lot of command and control legislation now. We actually have four eras of environmental United States environmental policy, and it started in when everyone started migrating to the West. So the early environmental policy of the United States is, in this case, migration and land, in this case, water rights, okay, and in this case, land rights. So I don't know if you noticed, when people went to the West, what they could do is they could just pay the government a very minimum amount of money to actually have like 50 acres. Okay, so that is actually the big drive of early environmental policy, is the settlement of the West. And obviously, with the settlement of the West, we, in this case, basically removed the Native Americans from their ancestral lands in this case. So the key area settlement and also gold, the gold rush, okay, if you want to think about it that way, in California that went on. What happened is a lot of problems occurred because of this extraction of natural resources and settlement, primarily extraction of natural resources. So what happens is there were a lot of problems, and so there was a big drive to try to go back to and as the West became settled, what happens is a lot of people got scared that the West, because it was pristine, it was clear, unlike the East Coast at that point, which was already like have a high density of population. A lot of people said, "Oh, we're gonna lose the West. We're gonna lose the grandeur of the outdoor, of the natural habitats like Yosemite or the mountains or whatever, all of these things, right? Rocky Mountains." So there was that big drive to try to save them, and one of the big drivers of this is actually Teddy Roosevelt, right? Teddy Roosevelt had a very depressing adulthood, lost his mom, lost his wife, and went to the Dakotas as a widow. Okay, as a widower, and what happened? Found nature, and because of that, he, in this case, obviously loved nature, and one of the big things that happened, one of the big myths that actually happened. This is just for entertainment purpose only, everyone. This is not going to be in any quiz or exam. It was the teddy bear. Like, there was a myth that he was, he saw a bear and he didn't want to shoot a bear when he was out hunting one day. Okay, well, right, that's all myth. Okay, but that's where teddy bear actually comes from. All right, so that's that. And then the third wave of environmental policy is probably from the 1930s to the 1960s, and that was actually triggered primarily by this book by Rachel Carson, which is called Silent Spring. All right, so there was a lot of what is not mentioned here is we also have Aldo Leopold, who actually was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. All right, so like in this case, San, like if you ever want to read books about the environment, please go and check your library and look for Aldo Leopold. Amazing, and again, have roots in Wisconsin. So that's that. Third wave. The modern environmental era started in 1970 with the passing of the National Environmental Policy Act. There were other policies and legislation that was trying to protect the environment that has been passed previous to this. But in terms of environmental era, because this is actually where the Environmental Protection Agency actually came up, right? So this is again the start of the modern era. And the big thing about the modern era is the EPA, originally speaking, was actually not an enforcement body. It was actually more of an advisory body. It would have to do research and actually would have to suggest things to the states and suggest things to the, but obviously there was some evolution that occurred after that. There's going to be a second video that will follow this, so make sure that you watch both set of videos to finish off this competency and this set of learning objectives.